Distinguished witnesses today, Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, Mike Pompeo, Director of the Defense Intelligence Agency, General Robert Ashley, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Chris Wray, Director of the National Security Agency, Admiral Mike Rogers, and Director of the Geospatial Intelligence Agency, Robert Cardillo. We've got a long day in front of us, and I thank all of you for being here. I know how forward you look to this one occasion on an annual basis. Since 1995, this committee's met in open forum to discuss the security threats facing the United States of America. This has never been, nor will it ever be, a comfortable conversation to have. The threats this country faces are complex, evolving, and without easy answers. They exist in multiple domains. They're asymmetrical and they're conventional. They can be launched from across the ocean or be planned in the heart of our homeland. Nonetheless, this conversation serves a vital purpose, and it's essential that it takes place in the public square with as much detail and candor as is possible. In my view, that is the true value and public service of this hearing. It provides the American people with insight that they just don't normally get. Those insights are about the spectrum of threats we're up against as a nation, but importantly, those insights are also about the work that the intelligence community does to push back on those threats. This is work that both time and labor intensive. It can be frustrating, heartbreaking, and dangerous. It's often thankless, but because of the tireless dedication and patriotism of men and women who make up our intelligence community, it gets done on behalf of the American people every single day. To this point, I encourage all the witnesses this morning to not only address the threats to our nation, but to talk about what their organizations are doing to help secure this country and to the degree they can in an unclassified setting. Director Coates, your testimony for the record ties together the expertise, capabilities, and wisdom of the entire intelligence community. I encourage everyone to familiarize themselves with its content. It's lengthy, and it's detailed, and it's a testament to the broad range of talents our IC brings to the table. It's also a compelling reminder of why this country invests so substantially in its intelligence apparatus. Director Pompeo, when we held this hearing last year, I invited you to share your assessments of the things on the Korean Peninsula. I'm going to ask you again for your insights on the state of North Korea's nuclear and missile program, and importantly, what's going on politically with North Korea's leadership. Perhaps you can help us differentiate between a genuine effort to reconcile with South Korea and an opportunistic attempt to drive a wedge between Washington and Seoul. General Ashley, the work just never seems to end for our Defense Department. I would value your latest assessment of the battlefield situations in Syria and Afghanistan. Last week, we had U.S. advisors and their Kurdish allies come under fire in eastern Syria. This prompted a retaliatory strike that killed dozens of pro-regime forces. In Afghanistan, a string of terrorist attacks in Kabul left 150 dead last month, suggesting to me that after 16 years of war, the insurgency is nowhere near folding, and the government remains hard-pressed to provide the security needed for its own people. I'd particularly value your unvarnished appraisal of where progress is being made in Afghanistan and where it's not. Admiral Rogers, cyber is clearly the most challenging threat vector this country faces. It's also one of the most concerning, given how many aspects of our daily lives in the United States can be disrupted by a well-planned, well-executed cyber attack. I'd appreciate your assessment of how well we're doing when it comes to protecting the nation's most critical computer networks, from the systems that guide our military to the networks that ensure the nation's energy supply. They are all essential to a functionality of a modern America, and I fear that they're increasingly vulnerable to state and non-state actors. Director Wray, I'm keenly interested in hearing your assessment of the threat posed by the spread of foreign technology in the United States. This committee has worked diligently to sound the alarm bells when it comes to the counterintelligence and information security risks that come prepackaged with the goods and services of certain overseas vendors. The focus of my concern today is China, and specifically Chinese telecom like Huawei and ZTE, that are widely understood to have extraordinary ties to the Chinese government. I hope you'll share your thoughts on this, and I also ask you to provide your insights into how foreign commercial investment and acquisitions are jeopardizing the nation's most sensitive technologies. Lastly, I'd like to spend a moment on the counterintelligence threat to our national academic research and laboratory construct. What's the scale of the problem, and what's the FBI doing to fight it? And finally, Director Cardillo, we've come to associate NGA with the modernization of the intelligence community. The adversaries of this country are investing in innovating faster and with fewer constraints than we are. The threats we face are multidimensional, decentralized, and global. NGA is playing an essential role and pushing the envelope with new ways of tackling problems, like having more data than you can feasibly analyze. As the IC edges closer to automation, machine learning, and eventually artificial intelligence, the computer learning and computer vision work at NGA will be a bridge to help us get there. I look forward to your thoughts on what's next at NGA and how the intelligence community as a whole can make better use of innovation and technologies to advance intelligence disciplines that have not changed much in the past 60 years. Our adversaries aren't going to wait for us to catch up. I'll close there because we have a lot to get to, but I want to thank you, and more importantly, I want to thank those who are not here with you, those who carry out the lion's share of the work on behalf of the American people, the intelligence community. The folks you represent are important to this committee. We can't do our oversight without the work they perform. Before turning to the distinguished Vice Chairman, I'd like to highlight for my colleagues, we will reconvene at 2:30 this afternoon in a closed session to hear from the same witnesses in a classified setting. I would ask members to please reserve anything that remotely gets into a classified question for the afternoon session. With that, Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and let me also welcome all of you here and echo the Chairman's comments. Thank you all for your service, and we hope you will convey back to all the brave men and women who work for you that this committee will always have your back. I think this open hearing comes at an extraordinarily important time. Our nation's intelligence agencies stand at the forefront of our defense against continuing threats from terrorist groups, extremist ideology, rogue regimes, nuclear proliferation, and regional instability. We all know, and we've discussed this at length, in recent years we've also seen the rise of nations who view themselves at least as competitors, if not as adversaries of the United States. They began to utilize new asymmetric weapons to undercut our democratic institutions, to steal our most sensitive intellectual property. Let me start with Russia. Obviously, certain questions remain with respect to the true extent of the Russian interference in the 2016 elections. And we'll work through these, continue to work through these in a bipartisan way on this committee. However, I think you'll find a broad bipartisan consensus on this committee on a number of critical issues. First, that Russia engaged in a coordinated attack to undermine our democracy. Second, that effort included targeting of state and local elections, electoral activities in 21 states. And third, the Russian effort in a new area utilized our social media platforms to push and spread misinformation at an unprecedented scale. Now, we've had more than a year to get our act together and address the threat posed by Russia and implement a strategy to deter further attacks. But I believe, unfortunately, we still don't have a comprehensive plan. 2 weeks ago, Director Pompeo publicly stated that he has every expectation that Russia will try to influence our upcoming elections. Secretary of State Tillerson just last week said that we're already seeing Russian efforts to meddle in the 2018 elections. But I believe in many ways we're no better prepared than we were in 2016. Make no mistake, this threat did not begin in 2016, and it certainly didn't end with the election. What we are seeing is a continuous assault by Russia to target and undermine our democratic institutions, and they're going to keep coming at us. Despite all this, the President inconveniently continues to deny the threat posed by Russia. He didn't increase sanctions on Russia when he had a chance to do so. He hasn't even tweeted a single concern. This threat, I believe, demands a whole-of-government response, and that response needs to start with leadership at the top. At the same time, other threats to our institutions come from right here at home. There have been some, aided and abetted by Russian internet bots and trolls, who've attacked the basic integrity of the FBI and the Justice Department. This is a dangerous trend. This campaign of innuendo and misinformation should alarm all of us, regardless of our partisan affiliation. In addition to this ongoing threat from Russia, I'm concerned that China has developed an all of society, not just all of government, but all of society approach to gain access to our sensitive technologies and intellectual property. I'm paying a great deal of attention to the rise of China's tech sector. In particular, I'm worried about the close relationship between the Chinese government and Chinese technology firms, particularly in the area of commercialization of our surveillance technology and efforts to shape telecommunication equipment markets. I want to ensure that the IC is tracking the direction that China's tech giants are heading, and especially to the extent which they are beholden to the Chinese government. In recent years, we've seen major technology firms whose rise is attributed in part to the illicit access of U.S. technology and IP. These companies now represent some of the leading market players globally. Most Americans have not heard of all of these companies, but as they enter Western economic markets, we want to ensure that they play by the rules. We need to make sure that this is not a new way for China to gain access to sensitive technology. Now, there are a number of other concerns I hope to raise both in the hearing this morning and in the closed hearing this afternoon. Let me just briefly mention two. First, how is the IC poised to track foreign influence that relies on social media and misinformation? Just last week, the chairman and I had a good meeting with our UK parliamentary colleagues investigating this issue. Russian trolls and bots continue to push divisive content both in the United States and against all our allies in Europe. Not only the UK, but as we've talked before, France, Germany, Netherlands, and we've also heard recent indications of Russian activities in Mexico. The IC needs to stay on top of this issue, and I'm worried that we don't have a clear line of assignment. Let me also raise another issue. I believe we need to do more to reform the broken security clearance system, which GAO recently placed on its list of high-risk government programs in need of reform. We've seen close to 700,000 folks now waiting in line, folks that need to serve our country, whether in government or in the private sector, who've been just waiting way too long to get their security clearances. It's obviously hampering your recruitment and retention, and it's costing us millions of dollars in inefficiency. Again, thank you to all of you for your service. Please convey our best wishes to the men and women who work with you, and I look forward to our hearing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. I'm going to recognize Director Coates, and he is the only one who will give a official testimony. All members of the panel are open for questions. I will recognize our members by order of seniority for up to 5 minutes. With that, Director Coates, the floor is yours.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I want to start by apologizing for my raspy voice. I've been fighting through some of the crud that's going around that several of us have endured. I may have to clear my throat a few times, which I apologize for. But It strikes me listening to your opening remarks and the Vice Chairman's opening remarks that, excuse me, that we have continued to have a very interactive presence with this committee. The issues that you and the Vice Chairman have raised and that others will raise are issues that we talk about continuously with you, and we want to continue to work with you carefully by both sides of the aisle here as we go forward looking at what the intelligence community can provide for this committee and the issues that we find in common. Vice Chairman Warner, members of the committee, we thank you for the opportunity to be with you here today. There have been some changes on the panel since we were here last year. This will be Admiral Rogers' last visit before this committee on the threat assessment issue. He deeply regrets not having to come before you in the future years, as he's enjoyed this process very much.
We're considering emeritus status so that he can be annually invited back.
We have two new members, Director Ray and General Ashley, who have been looking forward to this day, I'm sure, with great anticipation. And so I say all that because what you are looking at here is a team that works together in terms of how we provide the American people and our Congress and policymakers with the intelligence that they need. So it's an honor for us to be here, and I think this team reflects the hard work of the intelligence community in their testimonies and their answers to questions today. Before I begin the sobering portion of my remarks, let me take a moment to acknowledge a positive development for our intelligence community and express our thanks to members of this committee for their support in the renewing of the authorities, the recent 702 authorization. This is, as we have told you, our most important legislative issue because it is our most important collection issue against foreign terrorists and threats to America. And we appreciate the work that the committee has done and others have done, and particularly this team has done in reaching that goal. As you will hear during these remarks, we face a complex, volatile, and challenging threat environment. The risk of interstate conflict is higher than any time since the end of the Cold War, all the more alarming because of the growing development and use of weapons of mass destruction by state and non-state actors. Our adversaries, as well as the other malign actors, are using cyber and other instruments of power to shape societies and markets, international rules and institutions, and international hotspots to their advantage. We have entered a period that can best be described as a race for technological superiority against our adversaries who seek to sow division in the United States and weaken U.S. leadership. And non-state actors, including terrorists and criminal groups, are exploiting weak state capacity in Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Latin America, causing instability and violence both within states and among states. In the interest of saving time for your questions, I will not cover every topic in my opening remarks. I think that will be of relief to the committee. We are submitting a written statement, however, for the record with additional details. Let me turn to global threats, and I'd like to start with the cyber threat, which is one of my greatest concerns and top priorities. Frankly, the United States is under attack by entities that are using cyber to penetrate virtually every major action that takes place in the United States. From U.S. businesses to the federal government to state and local governments, the United States is threatened by cyber attacks every day. While Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea pose the greatest cyber threats, other nation states, terrorist organizations, transnational criminal organizations, and ever more technically capable groups and individuals use cyber operations to achieve strategic and malign objectives. Some of these actors, including Russia, are likely to pursue even more aggressive cyber attacks with the intent of degrading our democratic values and weakening our alliances. Persistent and disruptive cyber operations will continue against the United States and our European allies, using elections as opportunities to undermine democracy, sow discord, and undermine our values. Chinese cyber espionage and cyber attack capabilities will continue to support China's national security and economic priorities. Iran will try to penetrate U.S. and allied networks for espionage and lay the groundwork for future cyber attacks. And North Korea will continue to use cyber operations to raise funds, launch attacks, and gather intelligence against the United States. Terrorists will use the Internet to raise funds and promote their malign messages. Criminals will exploit cyber tools to finance their operations. My next topic for you is weapons of mass destruction, the WMD. Overall, state efforts to modernize, develop, or acquire WMD, their delivery systems, or the underlying technologies constitute a major threat to the United States and to our allies. North Korea will be the most volatile and confrontational WMD threat in the coming year. In addition to its ballistic missile tests and growing number of nuclear warheads for these missiles, North Korea will continue its long-standing chemical and biological warfare programs also. Russia will remain the most capable WMD power and is expanding its nuclear weapon capabilities. China will continue to expand its weapons of mass destruction options and diversify its nuclear arsenal. Iran's implementation of the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the JCPOA, has extended the time it would take to develop a nuclear weapon from several months to about a year, provided Iran continues to adhere to the deal's major provisions. Pakistan is developing new types of nuclear weapons, including short-range tactical weapons. And state and non-state actors, including the Syrian regime and ISIS, the remnants of ISIS in Syria, continue to possess and, in some cases, have used chemical weapons in Syria and Iraq, and we continue to be concerned about some of these actors' pursuit of biological weapons. Turning now to terrorism. The terrorism threat is pronounced and spans the sectarian spectrum from ISIS and al-Qaeda to Lebanese Hezbollah and other affiliated terrorist organizations, as well as the state-sponsored activities of Iran. U.S.-based, homegrown violent extremists have, including inspired and self-radical individuals, represent the primary and most difficult to detect Sunni terrorism threat in the United States. ISIS claimed to having a functioning caliphate that governs populations is all but thwarted. However, ISIS remains a threat and will likely focus on regrouping in Iraq and Syria, particularly in ungoverned portions of those countries, enhancing its global presence, championing its cause, planning international attacks, and encouraging members and sympathizers to attack their home countries. Meanwhile, al-Qaeda almost certainly will remain a major actor in global terrorism as it continues to prioritize a long-term approach, and the organization remains intent on attacking the United States and U.S. interests abroad. Now, moving on, as if we don't have enough threats here on Earth, we need to look to the heavens, threats in space. The global expansion of the space industry will extend space-enabled capabilities and situational awareness to nation-state and commercial space actors in the coming years. Russia and China will continue to expand their space-based reconnaissance, communications, and navigation systems in terms of numbers of satellites, breadth of capability, and applications for use. And both Russia and Chinese counter-space weapons will mature over the next few years as each country pursues anti-satellite weapons as a means to reduce U.S. and allied military effectiveness and perceptions of U.S. military advantage in space. And the final topical, functional topic is transnational organized crime, which poses a growing threat to U.S. and allied interests. These criminal groups will supply the dominant share of illicit drugs, fueling record mortality rates among our population. They will continue to traffic in human life. They will deplete national resources and siphon money from governments and the global economy. I'd like now to briefly go around the world on regional topics, starting with East Asia. You know, if you went out and hired a private plane and launched from Los Angeles and went around the world and stopped at every hot spot in this world, you would make multiple dozens of stops. That's the kind of threat that we face. But let me start with East Asia. North Korea continues to pose an ever more increasing threat to the United States and its interests. Pyongyang has repeatedly stated that it does not intend to negotiate its nuclear weapons and missiles away, because the regime views nuclear weapons are critical to its security. Kim also probably sees nuclear ICBMs as leverage to achieve his long-term strategic ambition to end Seoul's alliance with Washington and to eventually dominate the peninsula. In the wake of its ICBM tests last year, we expect to see North Korea press ahead with additional missile tests this year, and its foreign minister has threatened an atmospheric nuclear test over the Pacific. Pyongyang is committed to fielding a long-range nuclear-armed missile capable of posing a direct threat to the United States. And modest improvements in North Korea's conventional capabilities will continue to pose an ever greater threat to South Korea, Japan, as well as U.S. targets in those countries. China will increasingly seek to expand its regional influence and shape events and outcomes globally. It will take a firm stance on its claims to the East China Sea and South China Sea, its relations with Taiwan, and its regional economic engagement. China also intends to use its One Belt, One Road initiative to increase its reach to geostrategic locations across Eurasia, Africa, and the Pacific. From East Asia, we head to South Asia. In Afghanistan, Kabul continues to bear the brunt of the Taliban-led insurgency, as demonstrated by recent attacks in the city. Afghan national security forces face unsteady performance, but with coalition support, probably will maintain control of most major population centers. Complicating the Afghanistan situation, however, is our assessment that Pakistan-based militant groups continue to take advantage of their safe haven to conduct attacks in India, in Afghanistan, including U.S. interests therein. Pakistani military leaders continue to walk a delicate line. Ongoing Pakistani military operations against the Taliban and associated groups probably reflect a desire to appear more proactive and responsive to our requests for more actions against these groups. However, the actions taken thus far do not reflect a significant escalation of pressure against these groups and are unlikely to have a lasting effect. In the last month, the administration has designated 8 militants affiliated with the Taliban, Haqqani Network, and other Pakistani militant groups. And we assess that Pakistan will maintain ties to these militants while restricting counterterrorism cooperation with the United States. Next is Russia, where President Putin will continue to rely on assertive foreign policies to shape outcomes beyond Russia's borders. Putin will resort to more authoritarian tactics to maintain control amid challenges to his rule. With respect to Russian influence efforts, let me be clear. The Russians utilize this tool because it's relatively cheap, it's low risk, it offers what they perceive as plausible deniability, and is proven to be effective at sowing division. We expect Russia to continue using propaganda, social media, false flag personas, sympathetic spokesmen, and other means to influence to try to build on its wide range of operations and exacerbate social and political fissures in the United States. There should be no doubt that Russia perceived that its past efforts as successful and views the 2018 U.S. midterm elections as a potential target for Russian influence operations. From Russia, I'll turn to the Middle East and North Africa. This region will be characterized by political turmoil, economic fragility, and civil and proxy wars in the coming year. Iran will remain the most prominent state sponsor of terrorism and an adversary in the Middle East, especially in Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Iran will seek to expand its regional influence and will exploit the fight against ISIS to solidify partnerships and translate battlefield gains into political, security, and economic agreements. We also assess that Iran will continue to develop military capabilities that threaten U.S. forces and U.S. allies in the region. For example, Iran has the largest ballistic missile force in the Middle East. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, Navy, and its unsafe and unprofessional interactions pose a risk to U.S. naval and allied naval operations in the Persian Gulf. And Lebanese Hezbollah, with the support of Iran, has deployed thousands of fighters to Syria and provides direction to other militant and terrorist groups, all fomenting regional instability. Iran's provocative and assertive behavior, as we saw most recently this past weekend in northern Israel, increases the potential for escalation. Turkey will seek to thwart Kurdish ambitions in the Middle East, and the ongoing Turkish incursion into northern Syria is complicating ongoing counter-ISIS activities in the region and increases the risk to U.S. forces located in the area. Syria will face unrest and fighting through 2018, even as Damascus recaptures urban areas and violence decreases in some areas. Iraq is likely to face a lengthy period of political turmoil and conflict. The social and political challenges that gave rise to ISIS remain, and Iran has exploited those challenges to deepen its influence in Iraq's military and security elements and diplomatic and political arms. The war in Yemen between the Iranian-backed Houthis and the Saudi-led coalition is likely to continue and will worsen the already tragic humanitarian crisis for 70% of the population of about 20 million people in need of assistance. The situation in Yemen is emblematic of a far larger problem. The number of people displaced by conflict around the world is the highest that it's been since the end of World War II. Turning to Europe, where I want to draw your attention to two significant developments that are likely to continue to impact European politics and foreign policy in the coming year, let me state first, the continent's center of gravity appears to be shifting to France, where President Macron has taken a more assertive role in addressing European and global challenges. The results of the recent German election, I think, enforce that assessment. Second, recent efforts by some governments in Central and Eastern Europe to undermine judicial independence and parliamentary oversight and increase government control over public media are weakening the rules of law. These steps could presage further democratic decline and offer opportunity for Chinese and Russian influence. There are many more topics I could discuss. I haven't even gotten to the Western Hemisphere or Africa, but I would like to close with discussion of one additional threat, this one internal and somewhat personal. I'm concerned that our increasing fractious political process, particularly with respect to federal spending, is threatening our ability to properly defend our nation, both in the short term and especially in the long term. The failure to address our long-term fiscal situation has increased the national debt to over $20 trillion and growing. This situation is unsustainable, as I think we all know, and represents a dire threat to our economic and national security. Former Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mike Mullen, first identified the national debt as the greatest threat to our national security. Since then, he has been joined by numerous respected national security leaders of both parties, including former Secretaries of State Madeleine Albright and Henry Kissinger, as well as former Defense Secretaries Bob Gates and Leon Panetta. And our current Defense Secretary, Jim Mattis, agrees with this assessment. Many of you know I have spent a lot of time in my last term in the Senate working on this issue, and unfortunately the problem continues to grow. So I would urge all of us to recognize the need to address this challenge and to take action as soon as possible before a fiscal crisis occurs that truly undermines our ability to ensure our national security. With that, I and the rest of the panel are happy to take your questions. We appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Dan, thank you very much for that very thorough overview of the world and what's at play. I'll recognize members based upon seniority for up to 5 minutes. Chair recognizes himself. Admiral Rogers, according to the statement for the record, the intelligence community assesses that most detected Chinese cyber operations against the United States private industry are focused on cleared defense contractors or IT and communications firms whose products and services support government and private sector networks nationwide. Rate the intelligence community's performance when it comes to notifying clear defense contractors and other sensitive private sector actors about malicious cyber activities on their networks.
So first, in all honesty, you're asking me to rate a function for which I don't have responsibility or day-to-day execution. So I'll give you an opinion, but it's not informed by day-to-day experience per se. This is an issue both as NSA and as Cyber Commando. I try to work very aggressively because, as you have outlined, this is a tremendous concern for us as a department. Clearly, I think we are not where we need to be. The challenge, I think, is we've got multiple areas of knowledge and insight across the federal government, within the private sector, and how do we bring this together in an integrated team with some real-time flow back and forth? That is not where we are today, but that's where we've got to get to.
In your estimation, are we doing enough to warn the private sector of the threat that's out there?
I think we are informing them as we become aware of it, but one of my concerns is we're only going to see one slice of this picture. I'm also interested in, from the private sector's perspective, tell us what you are saying, and if we can bring these two together, we'll have such a broader perspective and much more in-depth knowledge of what's happening. I think that's part of this. It's not just, hey, one side needs to do a better job. I'm not trying to say it's a two-sided, but I think it's our ability to bring this together as a team.
Given that you've seen the difficulty, especially this committee and the intelligence community has had communicating with tech companies about a way forward that is in commonality, are you concerned at how this is going to become an increasingly challenging landscape for both Congress and for the intelligence community working as we see new tech firms emerge every day?
Yes, I am, because quite frankly, I wonder, so how bad does this have to get before we realize we have to do some things fundamentally differently? And I would argue if you look at the Internet of Things, you look at the security levels within those components, folks, this is going to orders of magnitude. If we think the problem is a challenge now, we just wait, it's going to get much, much worse exponentially from a security perspective.
Director Pompeo, the IC assesses that North Korea is likely to press ahead with more tests in 2018, missile tests, noting that North Korea's foreign minister indicated an atmospheric nuclear test over the Pacific may be under consideration by Pyongyang. What's the IC assess the regional reaction to this kind of test would be?
Senator, thanks for your question. And if I may just take 1 minute to say, I've been doing this a year now, and I want to express my appreciation to this committee for helping the CIA do the things it needs to do, providing us the resources and the authorities we need. And we've put a lot of effort against this very problem. You've all been incredibly supportive of that. And so my team thanks you for that. We think a test like that would certainly further unite the region. Having said that, our sense is that we have built a global coalition pushing back against Kim Jong-un and his terror regime. With respect to what each particular country might do, I'd prefer to keep that conversation to closed session this afternoon.
Great. What's the IC's assessment of North Korea's willingness to employ its expansive conventional military capabilities?
Senator, one of the things that Director Coates referred to in his opening remarks is that Kim Jong-un remains not only intent on staying in power, that the thing all dictators prefer to do, right? Die in their sleep fully at the peak of their power. But he has this mission that is a longstanding North Korean idea of reunification. And their capacity to use a nuclear umbrella combined with their conventional forces to exert coercive behavior, certainly inside their country, certainly against South Korea, but more broadly, is something that our analysts are continuing to look at. We can see as they ratchet up their nuclear capability, making a response more difficult, their capacity to do harm in the region as a result of their incredible conventional capabilities alone increases?
Probably for General Ashley and Admiral Rogers. According to statements for the record, the widespread proliferation of artificial intelligence is likely to prompt new national security concerns. How's the IC accounting for the possibility that these new national security concerns? Are we seeing indications now that our adversaries are working to harness emerging technologies like artificial intelligence? And is the IC looking to maximize the potential of emerging technologies in our own processing and analysis of data and intelligence?
So if I could take the first shot at that one. So as you look at DIA, and thanks for all the support the committee provides to the Defense Intelligence Agency. So if you look at our core mission, it's, you look at foreign militaries and the operational environment. So this is central to looking at doctrine and what they're developing. When you think about artificial intelligence, our near-peer competitors are pursuing this, and it's a lot of commercial technology that's available. But when you look at the volume and big data and what's available, the ability to digest and pull all that information in, artificial intelligence is going to be integral to that. Use an example of one of the projects we work on, and this is at the open source level, Project Maven. You look at full motion video, for example, or social media. In full motion video, you're never going to be able to afford the workforce that's going to be able to go through all the material, whether it's video, whether it's what Admiral Rogers works in the way of signals intelligence, or what's available in the social media. So artificial intelligence, machine learning, which is really kind of where we are right now. It's more machine learning than it is artificial intelligence. We're seeing all of our near-peer competitors invest in these kinds of technologies because it's going to get them to decision cycles faster, allow them to digest information in greater volumes, and have a better situational understanding of what's happening in the battle space, and in some cases just what's happening in the strategic environment.
So I would agree with General Ashley. I'd also highlight every organization on this table is faced with the challenge of victims of our own success in some ways. The ability to access data at increased levels brings its own set of challenges. So we are collectively all attempting to deal with this. When I look at potential adversaries, I see them going through the same set of challenges. I would argue when I look at the PRC in particular, there clearly is a national strategy designed to harness the power of artificial intelligence to generate strategic outcomes, many along the lines that General Ashley highlighted, to generate positive outcomes for them. If you look at their research, you look at how it is affecting the amount of data they are going after. I can remember 5-10 years ago looking at some data concentrations and thinking to myself, this is so large and has such a disparate amount of information in it. Boy, it would be really difficult for an opponent potentially to generate insight and knowledge from it. I don't have those kinds of conversations anymore. With the power of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and big data analytics, data concentrations now increasingly are targets of attraction to a whole host of actors. And you have watched the PRC and others engage in activity designed to access these massive data concentrations.
If I could follow up on that one also, because this is one of those areas that's available in the commercial industry. So you see a lot of investment, academia and others that are pursuing this. And so there's a key piece of this I think it's worth addressing as well, which is how do you operationalize it? So you go back and if I could just use kind of a World War II example, the fact that there were planes, radios, and tanks was not unique to the Germans in World War II. What they did is they came up with an operational concept that allowed them to leverage that. And Peter Singer, if anyone's ever read Wired for War or Ghost Fleet, is a futurist. And we set a panel with him a couple of years ago, and it was interesting when I asked him, as you look at the things that are emerging, the technology and things that are coming out, what do you see in the way of breakthrough that gives somebody a really marked advantage? And Peter's comment wasn't that I see something that gives someone such a marked advantage. It's who's able to harness it, who's able to operationalize it, and put it to effect. And so that's really a key difference, is a lot of that technology is going to be available globally.
Thank you.
If I could just ask your permission here. Robert Cardillo's agency, NGA, has probably taken a very significant lead on this, given the enormous volume of collection that they take and the inability to process that through the use of humans. I've asked Robert to be prepared to answer that question for you, because I think they're taking some leading efforts that might be helpful.
Great.
I think it's important to note at the front what hasn't changed. Quite frankly, the mission, the responsibility this whole table has is to provide you with decision advantage. What's changed is the world around us and now within us. And so what we used to hold exclusively, because we had capabilities that others didn't, is now more shared. And so, as Admiral Rogers has said, this is something that we all lock arms on, because it isn't the access that is exclusive anymore, it's the use. It's the concept of operations, as General Ashley said. I have the same concerns you do about getting the cooperation we need from these companies. I'm rather optimistic about it, because I think at the end of the day, we can advance the American economy, we can advance American entrepreneurship, and we can advance our understanding of the world in a way that gets back to that first step, which is decision advantage.
Rest assured, processing of data will come up in our closed session with you. I've got you targeted. Vice Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think I take with some note the fact that the ODNI director started his discussion with cyber. I think it's very telling in terms of how we view worldwide threats. Let me get one question out on the record. And we all know it's been over a year since the Russian intervention in our 2016 elections. We've also seen Russia intervene in a number of other Western democracies. I'd like each of you to briefly reconfirm to the American public that our intelligence community understands this threat. Last year, those of you who were on the panel each expressed confidence in the January 2017 IC assessment that Russia interfered in the 2016 elections. I'd like each of you today to, one, reaffirm that, and also, with a simple yes or no, do you agree with Director Pompeo that we haven't seen a significant decrease in the Russian activity, and we have every expectation, I think Director Coates, you've already alluded to this, that they'll try to continue to intervene in our elections in 2018 and 2020. I'll start with you, Director Cardillo. Simple yes or no will do.
Well, so no change in my view of the 2017 assessment. I support that, and I agree with Director Pompeo's assessment about the likelihood of the 2018 occurrence as well.
I participated in that 2017 work. I stood by it then. I stand by it now, and I agree with Director Pompeo. This is not going to change or stop.
General Ashley.
Yes, it is not going to change, nor is it going to stop.
Throughout the entire community, we have not seen any evidence of any significant change from last year.
I agree with Director Pompeo.
You've been waiting for that answer for a
I
long
have.
time.
I've had that one in the pocket for a while. Yes, sir.
As do I.
One area that I think we were a little all caught off guard on, and to a degree understandably, was how the Russians used social media. And I realize this is a new area for all of us, and there are legitimate issues around American civil rights that have to be balanced. But the fact is, I think we have to have an organized plan going forward. This question will be directed at DNI Coates and Director Wray, but if others want to weigh in, because the notion that these companies, while maybe located here, operate in cyberspace, and when we've got somebody masquerading as Mike Pompeo but is actually Boris Badenoff in St. Petersburg, it doesn't fit neatly into a particular flowchart. Director Coates and Director Wray, who is in charge of addressing the threat posed by foreign nationals or foreign nations in terms of their use and misuse of social media?
There's no single agency, quote, in charge. There are several agencies throughout the federal government that have equities in this, and we are working together to try to integrate that process. It clearly is something that needs to be addressed and addressed as quickly as possible. You and I have had a number of discussions about that, and so we are keen on moving forward in terms of not only identification but relative response and things that we can do to prevent this from happening. We are gaining more, I think, support, I guess is the right word, from the private sector, who are beginning to recognize ever more the issues that are faced with the material that comes through their processes. We cannot, as a government, direct them what to do, but we certainly are spending every effort we can to work with them to provide some answers to this question.
Dr. Ray.
I would agree with Director Coates. I think it's a team effort, and one of the things that's really jumped out at me since being back in government is how much more of a team the intelligence community is than the last time I was in this space. I have one of Mike's people who sits right, in my inner team and vice versa, and we're dealing with each other, every day. So it's teamwork within the intelligence community and then partnership with the private sector, which is, I think, the other big change I've noticed. There's a lot more forward-leaning engagement with the private sector in terms of trying to share information and raise awareness on their end, because at the end of the day, we can't fully police social media, so we have to work with them so that they can police themselves a little bit better as well.
Well, let me say, I think the companies themselves were slow to recognize this threat. I think they've still got more work to do, but the fact that we don't have clarity in terms of who's in charge means I don't believe we don't have a full plan. Let me just get one last question in quickly on the rise, the chairman's alluded to this as well, the rise of Chinese tech companies. And I know Senator Cornyn and Senator Feinstein have got legislation on CFIUS, but my fear is that some of these Chinese tech companies may not even have to acquire an American company before they become pervasive in our market. Again, I'll start with Director Coates and Director Ray. How do we make sure that we send a signal to the private sector before some of these companies, in effect, totally invade our market, particularly because so many of them are tied back to the Chinese government?
Well, I think it's not only sending a signal and working together, sharing information with the private sector and the public sector. It also, I think, involves almost a whole of government issue, in particular legislative, with the legislation that is being looked at in terms of the CFIUS process. I think we need to go beyond what the current process is in terms of evaluating. We as a community will coordinate our intelligence to provide the policymakers and those that are making these decisions with the best intelligence we can relative to what the situation is. And so we have this and view this as a top priority, and it's ongoing because, as I mentioned in my early remarks here, the Chinese are pervasive on this, and we've seen it happen throughout both the public and the private sector.
We've tried very hard to be more out and about in the private sector in terms of providing what are almost like defensive briefings, so that some of the U.S. telecommunications companies, among other technology industry members, kind of can recognize the threats that are coming their way. And I think I've been pretty gratified by the response that we've gotten by most companies once we're able to try to educate them. I think one of the bigger challenges we face is that because America is the land of innovation, there's a lot of very exciting stuff that's happening in terms of smaller startup companies. A lot of them are a lot less sophisticated about some of this stuff, and trying to make sure we're touching those and educating them as well is a continuing challenge. The reality is that the Chinese have turned more and more to more creative avenues using non-traditional collectors, which I think we in the intelligence community recognize, but I think the private sector is not used to spotting, and so a lot of it is trying to educate them about what to be on the lookout for and to have it be more of a dialogue.
Thank you. Senator Risch.
Thank you very much. First of all, I want to associate myself with remarks of the Vice Chairman when he said that this committee will always have your backs. For those of you who've been associated with this committee, Dan, since you used to sit here, and Director Pompeo, you ran the same operation across the way, and Mr. Cardillo, Mr. Rogers, you guys have seemed like part of the committee. We see you so much up there. You know that that's the case, and we sincerely appreciate that. I would say, however, and every one of us here knows what a tough job each of your agencies have. I'm speaking for myself, and I suspect for most, if not all of the committee, we have absolute 100% confidence in your ability to, in a very neutral, dispassionate fashion, deliver to us the facts that we need in order to make the policy decisions. One of the things that does rear its ugly head occasionally and causes issues, and it winds up in the media a lot more than it should, is when your jobs intersect with domestic political affairs. And Mr. Ray, probably you wind up with this more than anybody else. It gets messy, it gets difficult, and I think we've all got to recommit ourselves to what we're actually doing here to reach the right facts. I would respectfully disagree with my good friend from Virginia that we are no better prepared to handle the Russians' onslaught in 18 than we were in 16. When this happened in 16, those of us on this committee, those of you at the panel, and most of you, most everyone who works in the IC, were not surprised to find out that the Russians were attempting to meddle in our affairs. And after we had I think probably one of the best hearings we've had this year was the open hearing we had on how they use social media. And we saw how disjointed it was, how ineffective it was, how cheap it was for them to do that. But I think after that, with all due respect to my friend from Virginia, I think the American people are ready for this. I think that now they're going to look askance a lot more at the information that is attempted to be passed out through social media. The American people are smart people. They realize that there's people attempting to manipulate them, both domestically and foreign. And I agree with everybody on the panel that this is going to go on. This is the way the Russians have done business. This is no surprise to us. And we saw it even more so than we got it in France and Germany in the past year. So I think the American people are much more prepared than what they were before. Dan, thank you for that analysis of Syria. I doubt it made it any clearer for me or for the American people. It's a Rubik's Cube that is very difficult, and after this last weekend, I think got even more complicated. And I think that we're going to have to keep an eye on that. I agree with you. Cyber is certainly something that's right at the top. The financial condition of this country is of critical importance to us. I want to close, and I want to ask a specific question to four of you regarding Korea. I think that's the most existential threat that we face. I think it's something that's at our doorstep. A year ago when we talked about this, it was then, this is now. The movement of North Korea has not slowed down. In fact, if anything, I think all of us would agree that it's probably picked up, and it's at our doorstep. This is going to have to be dealt with in the very, very near future. We've talked about trying to engage in conversations and what conditions would be, et cetera. I think we're still in the process of refining that, but that's moving. We've all watched over the last week the SMILE campaign that North Korea has inflicted on the South Korean people. The South Korean people seem to be charmed by it to some degree. Some of them seem to be captivated by it. From my point of view, I think it's nothing more than a stall by the North Koreans to further develop what they're trying to do. And I suspect, in my judgment, I think we need to be very, very cautious of this. Director Coates, Pompeo, Rogers, and Ashley, I'd like to hear your view of this supposed turn in the last couple of weeks by the North Koreans.
Well, this is an existential threat, potentially to the United States, but also to North Korea. Kim Jong-un views this as any kind of a kinetic attack or effort to force him to give up his nuclear weapons is an existential threat to his nation and to his leadership in particular. As you know, it's a very hard topic, collection nation, given their secrecy and so forth. But we do know that Kim, it's a one-man decision. We have processes in place here in the United States to have multiple engagements with various agencies in terms of our policy making and relative to the decision that ultimately the president makes. That does not appear to be the case in North Korea. The provocative nature and the instability that Kim has demonstrated potentially is a significant threat to the United States. I agree with you that decision time is becoming ever closer, in terms of how we respond to this. Our goal is a peaceful settlement. We are using maximum pressure on North Korea in various ways, which can be described by my colleagues here. Most of that in open session, in closed session. But we have to face the fact that this is an potentially existential problem for the United States.
Wise words. Director Pompeo.
The last part of your question about this past now almost week at the Olympics, we should all, the American people should all remember that Kim Yo-jong is the head of the Propaganda and Agitation Department. There is no indication there's any strategic change in the outlook for Kim Jong-un and his desire to retain his nuclear capacity to threaten the United States of America. No change there.
Admiral Rogers.
I would just say if KJU thinks he can splinter the relationship between ourselves and the South Koreans, he is sadly mistaken.
And finally, Lieutenant General Ashley.
So no change to his strategic calculus. Matter of fact, under the KG regime, you've seen a much more deliberate effort in terms of readiness, very different from his father. So you got a 1 million-man army, 70% of it is south of Pyongyang, and they train in a very deliberate fashion. The strategic calculus is not changing, and we should not be misled by the events that are taking place around the Olympics.
Thank you so much. My time's up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Senator Feinstein.
Thanks very much. I want to associate myself with some of the comments of Senator Risch. And we just had a secure briefing last week, and I think it was difficult and harsh. I hearken back to the words of the Secretary of State on the 4 no's. And 1, that we do not seek regime change. 2, we are not seeking the accelerated reunion of the peninsula. And finally, that we will not bring U.S. forces north of the demilitarized zone, zone, if the Korean peninsula is reunified. Yeah, let me ask you, Mr. Pompeo, because you just spoke with some certainty. Does Kim Jong-un really understand and believe that our goals are not regime change or regime collapse?
Senator Feinstein, I can't give you any certainty about what Kim Jong-un actually subjectively believes. A very difficult intelligence problem anywhere in the world, most especially difficult there. And I have expressed this before. We do remain concerned. Our analysts remain concerned that Kim Jong-un is not hearing the full story. That is, that those around him aren't providing nuance, aren't suggesting to him the tenuous nature of his position both internationally and domestically, the breach with China, the deep connections between the United States and the Republic of Korea. We are not at all certain that the leaders around him are sharing that information in a way that is accurate, complete, and full.
In a recent Washington Post op-ed, Victor Cha, who was recently under consideration to be United States ambassador to South Korea, warned of the dangers of a preventive United States military strike against North Korea. He cautioned that such a strike would not halt North Korea's nuclear weapons program and could spark an uncontrolled conflict in the region that could kill hundreds of thousands of Americans. He is not the only one. A number of experts on the area have said that. And he argued to continue to press for multilateral sanctions at the UN to provide Japan and South Korea advanced weapons training and intel and some other things. Has the intelligence community assessed how the North Korean regime would react to a preventive United States attack?
We have. I would prefer to share that with you in closed session this afternoon. That is.
Would you do that this
yes,
afternoon? Yes,
absolutely, Senator. Yes, we have written about various forms of actions, what we analyze, the certainty and uncertainty we have around that analysis, as well as what we think happens in the event that the United States decides not to do that and continues to allow Kim Jong-un to develop his nuclear weapons arsenal.
Have you explored what it would take to bring them to the table?
We have. I'd prefer to share that with you in closed session. Yes, ma'am.
This afternoon as well.
Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Feinstein. Senator Rubio.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I also echo the same words everyone else has shared with you about the esteem we have for all of our agencies and the important work they do. And I think this has already been touched upon, I do believe that Russia, Vladimir Putin in particular's efforts around the world are very important, but the biggest issue of our time, in my view, and I think in the view of most of the members of this committee, and I would venture to guess most of the members of this panel, is China and the risks they pose. I'm not sure in the 240-some-odd-year history of this nation we've ever faced a competitor and potential adversary of this scale, scope, and capacity. It is my personal view, and it's shared by many people, that they are carrying out a well-orchestrated, well-executed, very patient, long-term strategy to replace the United States as the most powerful and influential nation on earth. You see that reflected in this repeated use of this term community of common destiny, which basically means a retreat from Western values of democracy and freedom and openness towards some other model that benefits them. And their pursuit of this appears to be every element of their national power, their military, commercial, trade, economics, information and media. The tools they use are everything from hacking into companies and critical infrastructure and defense contractors, everybody you can imagine, to using our immigration system against us, to even our universities. And that's where I wanted to begin this week. Well, let me just ask this, and I'd start this with Director Coates. Is it your view that the United States today, as a government, is prepared for the scale, scope, and magnitude of the challenge presented by this plan that China is carrying out?
We have full awareness of what the Chinese are attempting to have full awareness of what the Chinese are attempting to do on a global basis. There's no question that that what you have just articulated is what's happening with China. They're doing it in a very smart way. They're doing it in a very effective way. They are looking beyond their own region. I think it's clear that they have a long-term strategic objective to become a world power, and they are executing throughout the whole of government ways in which they can accomplish that. We have intensive studies going on throughout the intelligence community relative to A to Z on what China is doing. General Mattis has asked us for that. Others have asked us to provide that. Senator Warner called me last week. We had a discussion on that. I assured him that we are pulling all of our elements of intelligence gathering together to provide a very, very deep dive into what China's plan is doing now and what their plans are for the future and how it would impact on the United States.
Just to kind of highlight the different ways and untraditional ways in which they're pursuing this plan, Director Wray, let me ask you, what in your view could you say in this setting is the counterintelligence risk posed to U.S. national security from Chinese students, particularly those in advanced programs in the sciences and mathematics?
I think in this setting, I would just say that the use of non-traditional collectors, especially in the academic setting, whether it's professors, scientists, students, we see in almost every field office that the FBI has around the country. It's not just in major cities; it's in small ones as well. It's across basically every discipline, and I think the level of naivete on the part of the academic sector about this creates its own issues. They're exploiting the very open research and development environment that we have, which we all revere, but they're taking advantage of it. So one of the things we're trying to do is view the China threat as not just a whole of government threat, but a whole of society threat on their end, and I think it's going to take a whole of society response by us. So it's not just the intelligence community, but it's raising awareness within our academic sector, within our private sector as part of the defense.
Well, in that vein, last week I wrote a letter to 5 higher education institutions in Florida about the Confucius Institutes, which are funded by Chinese government dollars at U.S. schools. And it is my view that they're complicit in these efforts to covertly influence public opinion and to teach half-truths designed to present Chinese history, government, or official policy in the most favorable light. Do you share concerns about Confucius Institutes as a tool of that whole of society effort and as a way to exploit the sort of naive view among some in the academic circles about what the purpose of these institutes could be?
We do share concerns about the Confucius Institutes. We've been watching that development for a while. It's just one of many tools that they take advantage of. We have seen some decrease recently in their own enthusiasm and commitment to that particular program, but it is something that we're watching warily and in certain instances have developed, appropriate investigative steps.
Senator White.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Vice Chairman Warner highlighted in his opening statement the importance of an effective security clearance process. So I've got a question for you, Director Wray. Was the FBI aware of allegations related to Rob Porter and domestic abuse? And if so, was the White House informed this could affect his security clearance? When were they informed? And who at the White House was informed?
Well, Senator, there's a limit to what I can say about the content of any particular background investigation for a variety of reasons that I'm sure you can appreciate. I would say that the background investigation process involves a fairly elaborate set of standards, guidelines, protocols, agreements, et cetera, that have been in place for 20-plus years. And I'm quite confident that in this particular instance, the FBI followed established protocols.
So was the White House informed that this could affect his security clearance? That's a yes or no.
I can't get into the content of what was briefed.
What were they informed?
What I can tell you is that the FBI submitted a partial report on the investigation in question in March, and then a completed background investigation in late July. That soon thereafter we received requests for follow-up inquiry, and we did the follow-up and provided that information in November, and then we administratively closed the file in January. And then earlier this month, we received some additional information, and we passed that on as well.
Okay. Let me turn now to the two recent arbitrary and inconsistent decisions that affect the politicizing of the classification system. The first was the public release of the Nunes memo. The second involved the report that the Congress required on Russian oligarchs, their relationship with President Putin, and indications of corruption. In that case, the Secretary of the Treasury released nothing other than a list of rich Russians taken from public sources. My question, and any of you can respond, did any of you take a position on either of these two arbitrary classification decisions? And did any of you have any communications with the White House about either of those classification matters?
I'll start, and the answer is no.
No.
I raised concerns on this issue with the DNI.
No.
Yeah, the CIA was not asked to review the classification of those documents.
Not on the second, the oligarch treasury document. We did have interaction about the memo from Chairman Nunes.
Is there anything you can say that protects sources and methods in an open session with respect to that matter?
Well, I would just say, that, as we said publicly, that we had grave concerns about that memo's release.
Okay. On encryption, Director Wray, as you know, this isn't a surprise because I indicated I would ask you about this. You have essentially indicated that companies should be making their products with back doors in order to allow you all to do your job. And we all want you to protect Americans, and at the same time, sometimes there's these policies that make us less safe and give up our liberties. And that's what I think we get with what you all are advocating, which is weak encryption. Now, this is a pretty technical area, as you and I have talked about. And there's a field known as cryptography. I don't pretend to be an expert on it. but I think there is a clear consensus among experts in the field against your position to weaken strong encryption. So I have asked you for a list of the experts that you have consulted. I haven't been able to get it. Can you give me a date this afternoon when you will give me, this morning, a sense of when we will be told who are these people who are advising you to pursue this route? Because I don't know of anybody respected in the field who is advising that it is a good idea to adopt your position to weaken strong encryption. So can I get that list?
We'd be happy to talk more about this topic this afternoon. My position is not that we should weaken encryption. My position is that we should be working together, government and the private sector, to try to find a solution that balances both concerns.
I'm on the program for working together. I just think we need to be driven by objective facts, and the position you all are taking is out of sync with what all the experts in the field are saying, and I would just like to know who you all are consulting with, and we'll talk some more about it this afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Collins.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Pompeo, last week the New York Times published a report that alleged that U.S. intelligence officials had paid $100,000 to a Russian source for phony secrets, including potentially compromising information about the president and information on certain tools allegedly stolen from the NSA. First, is it accurate that the CIA has categorically denied the assertions in this story? And second, if so, what would be the motivations of a Russian who peddled this story to the New York Times and other Western media outlets? Is this part of the Russian campaign to undermine faith in Western democracies?
Senator Collins, first, let me say thanks for the question. Reporting on this matter has been atrocious. It's been ridiculous, totally inaccurate. In our view, the suggestion the CIA was swindled is false. The people who were swindled were James Ricin and Matt Rosenberg, the authors of those two pieces. Indeed, it's our view that the same two people who were proffering phony information to the United States government proffered that same phony information to these two reporters. The Central Intelligence Agency did not provide any resources, no money, to these two individuals who proffered U.S. government information, directly or indirectly, at any time. And the information that we were working to try and retrieve was information that we believed might well have been stolen from the U.S. government. It was unrelated to this idea of compromise that appears in each of those two articles.
Thank you. Director Wray, the President has repeatedly raised concerns about current and former FBI leaders and has alleged corruption and political bias in the performance of the FBI's law enforcement and national security missions. I want to give you the opportunity today to respond to those criticisms. What is your reaction?
Well, Senator, I would say that my experience now 6 months in with the FBI has validated all my prior experiences with the FBI, which is that it is the finest group of professionals and public servants I could hope to work for. And every day, many times a day, I'm confronted with unbelievable examples of integrity and professionalism and grit. There are 37,000 people in the FBI who do unbelievable things all around the world, and although you would never know it from watching the news, we actually have more than 2 investigations, and most of them do a lot to keep Americans safe.
Thank you. That's one of the reasons I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond. Director Coates, we've had a lot of discussion this morning about Russian attempts, which are ongoing, to influence elections in Western democracies, to undermine NATO, and to try to destroy institutions in our country and elsewhere. This is an election year in our country, and it's frankly frustrating to me that we haven't passed legislation to help states strengthen the security of their voting systems. Putting that issue aside, there's also going to be an election this year in Latvia, one of our NATO allies. What is your assessment of whether or not the Russians are actively engaged in trying to influence that election, and how concerned is the intelligence community that they might be successful in producing a government that is very sympathetic to Russia's foreign policy objectives?
Not only are we concerned, the 29 nations of NATO are concerned. I returned not that long ago from a meeting in Brussels with the intelligence arm of NATO. All 29 nations, the topic was addressed primarily on Russian meddling in elections and trying to undermine democratic values. At the end of that, the new director of that organization asked for a show of hands of or any verbal response from any representatives of the 29 nations if they thought that Russia had not interfered with their processes and particularly their elections or had the potential to do so. Not one person raised their hand. He said, so do I understand that we are unanimous in assessing what the Russians are trying to do to undermine our elections, to undermine our coordination with the United States and relationships with each other, to undermine the very basic principles of sharing with our European countries, everything that is accomplished through NATO. Do I understand that no one has an objection to it? You all see this for what it is? Dead silent. He said, I take silence to be consent. So I think that says that this is pervasive, that the Russians have a strategy that goes well beyond what's happening here in the United States, even though while they have historically tried to do these kinds of things, clearly in 2016 they upped their game. They took advantage, sophisticated advantage of social media. They're doing that not only in the United States, they're doing that throughout Europe and perhaps elsewhere. And so I think that sends a very strong signal that any elections that are coming up we need to assume that there might be interference with that, particularly from the Russians and maybe from some other malign actors. And steps need to be taken to work with state and local officials because many of these elections in off the year will be state and local, governorships, even members of certain houses of representation within the states themselves. So it clearly is an issue that is whole of government, and I would say this, the more, and we also agreed with this at Brussels, and I've tried to make that point while I was there, the more transparency we can provide to the American people, to people of nations that see this threat coming, the better off we will be. Obviously, we have to take other measures, but we need to inform the American public that this is real, that this is going to be happening, and the resilience needed for us to stand up and say we're not going to allow some Russian to tell us how to vote, how we ought to run our country. And I think there needs to be a national cry for that.
Thank you. Very valuable.
Senator Heinrich.
Thank you, Chairman. Director Ray, the FBI has been accused of political bias recently against the President by the President himself. In fact, he said the FBI's reputation is, quote, in tatters. Do you think the FBI's reputation is in any way in tatters? And are you confident in the independence of your agents?
Senator, there's no shortage of opinions about our agency, just like every other agency up here and just like the Congress. I can only speak from my experience. And
I hope you're doing better than the Congress.
And my experience has been that every office I go to, every division I go to has patriots, people who could do anything else with their careers but have chosen to work for the FBI because they believe in serving others. And the feedback I get from our state and local law enforcement partners, from our foreign partners, from the folks we work with in the private sector and the community, office after office after office has been very, very gratifying and reassuring to me. And I'm a big believer in the idea that the FBI speaks through its work, through its cases, through the victims it protects. And I encourage our folks not to get too hung up on what I consider to be the noise on TV and in social media.
So you haven't seen any evidence of some sort of inherent political bias in the agency?
No.
How do statements like that impact the morale of rank-and-file agents, or are they able to shake that off?
Well, we have 37,000 people. They're all individuals. They all think in their own way. But I guess I would say that our people are very mission-focused. They're accustomed to the fact that we do some of the hardest things there are to do for a living. And I like to think that our folks are pretty sturdy. I think of a woman I met just the other day, an agent in the Miami office who had a bad accident, 12 stitches in her face, and the next day, boom, right back at work. I think about the folks in the San Juan office that I visited recently. You want to talk about people going through a real storm. Right. They do it, and they're out in the community. And I can tell you the community values what they do on the island.
Thank you. An op-ed by a number of former intelligence analysts called the Nunes memo and its release, quote, one of the worst cases of politicization of intelligence in modern American history, end quote. You said you had concerns about that memo. I know you can't get into the gritty details of that, but can you say in your view whether or not one of those concerns is that it may have selectively cherry-picked information without presenting the entire fact pattern that led up to that FISA warrant application?
Well, Senator, I would just repeat what we said at the time, which is that we had then and continue to have now grave concerns about the accuracy of the memorandum because of omissions. We provided thousands of documents that were very sensitive and lots of briefings, and it's very hard for anybody to distill all that down to 3.5 pages.
Director Pompeo, have you seen Russian activity in the lead up to the 2018 election cycle?
Yes. So I paused only. I'm trying to make sure I stay on the unclassified side. Yes, we have seen Russian activity and intentions to have an impact on the next election cycle here.
Director Coates?
Yes, we have.
Anyone else? Admiral Rogers?
Yes, and I think this would be a good topic to get into greater detail in this afternoon.
According to news reports, there are dozens of White House staff with only interim security clearances still, to include Jared Kushner until last week, to include White House Staff Secretary Rob Porter, who I would assume would have regularly reviewed classified documents as part of his job. Director Coates, if someone is flagged by the FBI with areas of concern in their background investigations into White House staff with interim clearances, should those staff continue to have access to classified materials?
Let me first just speak in general relative to temporary classifications. Clearly, with the new administration in particular, we're trying to fill a lot of new slots. And the classification process and security clearance process, as has been mentioned.
Yeah, I'm only speaking with regard to folks who may have had issues raised as opposed to just being in the matter, of course, of going through a long process.
Well, I'm not in a position, and we can talk about this in the classified session, but I'm not in a position to discuss what individual situations are for specified individuals. I might just say that. I think sometimes it is necessary to have some type of preliminary clearance in order to fill a slot. But I have publicly stated if that is the case, the access has to be limited in terms of the kind of information they can be in a position to receive or or not receive. So I think that's something that we have to do as a part of our security clearance review. The process is broken. It needs to be reformed. It doesn't, as Senator Warner has previously said, it's not evolution, it's revolution. We have 700,000 backups. So we have situations where we need people in places, but they don't yet have that. Your specific question, I think I'd like to take up in the classified session.
Chairman, I'm over my time. Thank you, Director Coates.
Senator Blunt.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Coates, Director Pompeo, Admiral Rogers, I think you all talked about evidence that the Russians would intend to do things to be active in our elections. There really, it seems to me, two divisions of that activity. One is information that's put on the record that misleading, false, trying to develop that level. The other, even more sinister, might be the level of dealing with the election system itself, the voting day system, the registration system, and of those two, clearly the voting day system, the one we need to have the most concerns about, that critical infrastructure. You know, this committee has been working toward both of those goals of trying to shore up critical infrastructure on Election Day, as well as alert people to and decide what might be done about misinformation on the other side of the ledger. Voting begins in March. That's next month. If we're going to have any impact on securing that voting system itself, it would seem to me that we need to be acting quickly. I think a great part of the strength of the system is the diversity of the system, different not only from state to state, but from election jurisdictions within those states. That's a strength, not a weakness in my view. But what are some of the things we can do to be more helpful to local election officials in encouraging them to share information when they think their systems are being attacked, getting more information to them than we have? There was a lot of criticism in the last cycle that we knew that some election systems were being attacked and didn't tell them they were being attacked. And so the three of you, in any order, let's just do the order that I started with, Director Coates, Director Pompeo, Admiral Rogers, any thoughts you have on what we can do to protect the critical infrastructure of the election system and how quickly we need to act if we intend to do that this year?
Well, the intelligence community, all elements of it, are aware, and we want to provide, collect and provide as much information as we can so that we can give those warnings and alerts, so that we can share information back and forth with local and state and election processes with the federal government. Department of Homeland Security, Department of FBI, obviously are more involved given these are domestic issues, but we do look to every piece of intelligence we can gather so that we can provide these warnings. It is an effort that I think the government needs to put together at the state and local level and work with those individuals who are engaged in the election process in terms of the security of their machines. Cyber plays a major role here, and so I think it is clearly an area where the federal government, foreign collection on potential threats and of interference, warnings, and then processes in terms of how to put in place security and secure that to ensure the American people that their vote is sanctioned and well and not manipulated in any way whatsoever.
Director Pompeo.
Senator Blunt, when I answered Senator Heinrich's question earlier, I was referring to the former, the first part of your question, not truly to the latter. The things we've seen Russia doing to date are mostly focused on information types of warfare, the things that Senator Warner was speaking out most directly earlier. With respect to the CIA's role, and I think Admiral Rogers will say his too, we have two missions. One is to identify the source of this information, make those here domestically aware of it so that they can do the things they need to do, whether that's FBI or DHS, so that they have that information. We are working diligently along many threat vectors to do that. And then the second thing, and we can talk more about this afternoon, is we do have some capabilities offensively to raise the cost for those who would dare challenge the United States elections.
And after Admiral Rogers, Director Ray, I may want to come to you and see on that same sharing information, any impediments to sharing that information with local officials, or any reason we wouldn't want to do that. Admiral Rogers?
Senator, the only other thing I would add, and this is also shaped by my experience as Cyber Command, where I defend networks, is one of the things that we generally find in that role, many network and system operators do not truly understand their own structures and systems. And so one of the things that I think is part of this is how do we help those local, federal, state entities truly understand their network structure, what its potential vulnerabilities, and to harness this information that the intelligence structure and other elements are providing them. It's not necessarily an intel function, but I think it's part of how do we work our way through this process.
Director Wray?
Senator, I think this is one of the areas that there's been a lot of discussion about whether we're doing better, and this is one of the areas I think we are doing better. We together at the FBI, together with DHS, recently, for example, scheduled meetings with various state election officials, and normally the barrier there would be classification concerns, whether somebody had clearances. We were able to put together briefings appropriately tailored and with non-disclosure agreements with those officials. So there are ways, if people are a little bit creative and forward-leaning, to educate the state election officials, which is, of course, where elections are run in this country.
Well, hopefully we'll be creative and forward-leaning, and we'll want to keep track of what we're doing there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First statement I want to make is more in sorrow than in anger. I'll get to the anger part in a minute. The sorrow part is that, Director Coates, in response to a question from Senator Collins, you gave an eloquent, factual statement of the activities of the Russians and the fact that they're continuing around the world and that they're a continuing threat to this country. All of you have agreed to that. If only the President would say that. I understand the President's sensitivity about whether his campaign was in connection with the Russians, and that's a separate question, but there is no question. We've got before us the entire intelligence community that the Russians interfered in the election in 2016. They're continuing to do it, and they're a real imminent threat to our elections in a matter of 8 or 9 months. My problem is I talk to people in Maine who say the whole thing is a witch hunt and it's a hoax because the President told me. I just wish you all could persuade the President as a matter of national security to separate these two issues. The collusion issue is over here, unresolved. We'll get to the bottom of that. But there's no doubt, as you all have testified today, and we cannot confront this threat, which is a serious one, with a whole-of-government response when the leader of the government continues to deny that it exists. Now, let me get to the anger part. The anger part involves cyber attacks. You have all testified that we're subject to repeated cyber attacks. Cyber attacks are occurring right now in our infrastructure all over this country. I am sick and tired of going to these hearings, which I've been going to for 5 years, where everybody talks about cyber attacks, and our country still does not have a policy or a doctrine or a strategy for dealing with them. And this is not a criticism of the current administration. I'm an equal opportunity critic here. The prior administration didn't do it either. Admiral Rogers, until we have some deterrent capacity, we are going to continue to be attacked. Isn't that true?
Yes, sir. We have to change this current dynamic because we're on the wrong end of the cost equation here.
And we are trying to fight a global battle with our hands tied behind our back. Director Coates, you have a stunning statement in your report. They will work to use cyber operations to achieve strategic objectives unless they face clear repercussions for their cyber operations. Right now, there are none. Is that not the case? There are no repercussions. We have no doctrine of deterrence. How are we ever going to get them to stop doing this if all we do is patch our software and try to defend ourselves?
Those are very relevant questions, and I think everyone, not only at this table, but in every agency of government, understands the threat that we have here and the impact already being made through these cyber threats. Our role as the intelligence community is to provide all the information we possibly can as to what is happening so our policymakers can take that, including the Congress, and shape policy as to how we are going to respond to this and deal with this in a whole of government way.
It just never seems to happen. Director Pompeo, you understand this issue, do you not? We are not going to be able to defend ourselves from cyber attacks by simply being defensive. We have to have a doctrine of deterrence. If they strike us in cyber, they are going to be struck back in some way. It may not be cyber.
I would agree with you. I would also argue that, and while I can't say much in this setting, I would argue that your statement that we have done nothing does not reflect the responses that, frankly, some of us at this table have engaged in, and the United States government has engaged in both before and after this but both during and before this administration.
But deterrence doesn't work unless the other side knows it. The doomsday machine in Dr. Strangelove didn't work because the Russians hadn't told us about it.
It's true that it's important that the adversary know it. It is not a requirement that the whole world know it.
And the adversary does know it, in your view?
I'd prefer to save that for another forum.
Well, I believe that this country needs a clear doctrine. What is a cyber attack? What is an act of war? What will be the response? What will be the consequences? And right now, I haven't.
Senator, I agree.
I haven't seen it.
I agree with you. We collectively, it is a complicated problem given the nature of.
Include us, by the way.
Yes, I would too. And as I sat as a member of the House of Representatives for 6 years, I take responsibility for not having been part of solving that too. There is a lot of work here to do. We do need a U.S. government strategy and clear authorities to go achieve that strategy.
I appreciate it. I just don't want to go home to Maine when there's a serious cyber attack and say, well, we never really got to it. We knew it was a problem, but we had 4 different committees of jurisdiction, and we just couldn't work it out.
Yes, sir.
That's not going to fly.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your service.
Senator, I might just add that we don't want to learn this lesson the hard way. 9/11 9/11 took place because we were not coordinating our efforts. We are now coordinating our efforts, but we didn't have the right defenses in place because the right information was not there. Our job is to get that right information to the policymakers and get on with it because it's just common sense. If someone is attacking you and there's no retribution or response, it's just going to incentivize more contacts.
Right.
Right now, there are a lot of blank checks. There's a lot of things that we need to do.
Director Coates, thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Langford.
Thank you. Director Coates, you and I talked last year about this same issue that Senator King was just bringing up as well about cyber doctrine and a point person on who that would be and a defined person that would give options to the President and to Congress to say if a response is needed and is warranted. This is the person, this is the entity that would make those recommendations and allow the President to be able to make decisions on what the proper response is. Has that been completed? Is there a point person to be able to give recommendations on an appropriate response to a cyber attack to the President?
That has not yet been completed. Of course, your understanding of the stand-up of Cyber Command and the new director that will be replacing Admiral Rogers, the decision relative to whether there would be a separation between the functions that are currently now NSA and cyber is yet to be made. General Mattis is contemplating what the next best step is, and there's they've involved the intelligence community in terms of making decisions in that role. But we, at this particular point, cannot point to one sort of cyber czar, but various agencies throughout the federal government are taking this very, very seriously, and there are individuals that we continue to meet on a regular basis. The OD&I has something called CTIC, and that is a coordination effort for all the cyber that comes in so that we don't stovepipe like what we did before 9/11. So things are underway, but in terms of putting a finalized this is how we're going to do it together is still in process.
Senator Langford, with respect to responses to that, these are Title X DOD activities unless they are granted to some other authority, a Title 50 authority. So there is a person responsible. Secretary Mattis has that responsibility to advise the President on the appropriateness of responses in all theaters of conflict with our adversaries.
Okay, thank you. I want to bring up the issue of the rising threat of what's happening just south of our border in Mexico. In Mexico, homicide rate went up 27% last year. We had 64,000 Americans that died from overdose of drugs. The preponderance of those came through or from Mexico. We have a very rapidly rising threat, it appears to me. What I'd be interested from y'all is on a national security level and what you're seeing. What are we facing? What's changing right now in Mexico versus 10 years ago Mexico and our relationship and the threats that are coming from there?
I would defer to Director Wray relative to what his agency is doing. I mean, clearly we have a continuing problem, and the Mexican government has a continuing problem relative to the gangs and the organizations. There have been some high-profile arrests lately. We've taken down some labs. Mexico is cooperating, but and they themselves will admit that it's almost overwhelming. For their army's been participating. It's almost overwhelming for them to control the situation south of the border. We have our own issues then on border protection and as well as consumption here in the United States.
Director Wray.
In many ways, what we're seeing is just more of the same, but one of the things that's changed, because I think that was at the heart of your question, I think we're seeing, one of the things we're watching in particular is more black market fentanyl being shipped to transnational criminal organizations in Mexico, and then, you know, they're taking advantage of the pricing advantages, and that's being then delivered in large quantities to our streets. Certainly, the Mexico relationship is, from a law enforcement perspective and from a domestic security perspective, one of our most important. I think the FBI LEGAT office in Mexico is our largest in the world. I'm pretty sure about that, or pretty close to it, if not. And that's a reflection of how much activity there is.
Let me ask you a specific Oklahoma question that's also a national question. There was an individual named Al-Falaj that was picked up in Weatherford, Oklahoma, just a couple of weeks ago by the FBI. His fingerprints were identified from a terror training camp in Afghanistan. He'd been in the country for multiple years. And what I'm trying to be able to determine is the coordination of information to local law enforcement and from data that's gathered from some of the work that's happening overseas in Afghanistan and such. How are those two being married together that we can identify individuals that are a threat to our nation based on their participation in a terror training camp overseas now coming to the American shores?
Well, certainly we've become better at looking at biometric information from overseas and marrying it up with potential threat subjects here in the U.S. as well as in some of our allies. The individual in question, of course, turned out to have his fingerprints on information from the Al-Farouk camp. And it's just a reminder to us that, you know, an awful lot of people went through those camps. And while the civilized world, the intelligence community, law enforcement, military, our allies around the world made a major dent on those people, we're kidding ourselves if we think that an awful lot of them aren't still out there. And it's just a reminder that we need to stay on the balls of our feet.
Right.
Senator Langford, if I could, just one additional point. You asked what has changed in Mexico. What has also transpired over the last couple of years is you had 5 principal cartels. We alluded to a number of captures that have taken place, over 100. Those 5 cartels have kind of devolved into 20, and part of that outgrowth, you've seen an increase in the level of violence.
Senator Manchin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank all of you. First, let me just say on behalf of the people of West Virginia, I want to thank you for the job you do in keeping us safe. The professionalism, and we have all the utmost confidence in what you're doing and hope to be able to support even further. But thank you. The people really do appreciate it, and we appreciate the service you're giving. Director Coates, I think you and I both were in the Senate at the same time when Mike Mullen, then Admiral Mullen, said that the greatest threat we face. I was just on Armed Services. You were on Intelligence at that time, and we were trying to find out what the greatest threat the United States faces. And I was thinking of another country, whether it be Russia, China, or whatever. And he didn't hesitate when he said that the threat of our nation, the greatest threat, is the death of our nation. And I think you just reiterated that in your opening remarks. Director, I was a little bit missed about the report, the Worldwide Threat Assessment. You didn't mention the debt in here. It wasn't in the report as a threat to the nation. And I didn't know if there was a thought process behind that, because you made a tremendous effort to put that in your opening statement. I appreciate that. But tell me what your thought process here was.
Well, my thought process was that I'm getting a little bit out of my lane in terms of what I'm supposed to do, but I felt that
I mean, you do think it's a threat. It's not in this assessment.
it's a threat that, it's something that Congress needs to deal with, and I didn't want to come back and preach at you.
I got you.
But I thought at the very end, in fact, just yesterday, look, I think I have a responsibility to raise this issue because it does affect the military significantly. It affects the intelligence community, which is tied to the military in terms of intelligence. It's going to have a serious effect on us.
Well, you said on both sides of the aisle. The only thing that seems to be bipartisan here today is spending money. Both sides seem to agree on spending more money without any accountability. So I'm glad to hear your remarks on that. If I could, to all the witnesses, I share what Senator Langford has said about concerns about what's killing more Americans than any of the threats discussed that we have today, and it's with drugs. My state of West Virginia has been hit harder than any state. I got more deaths per capita than any state. It's been ravaging as far as my communities, my homes, my schools, the families. It's just unbelievable what we're going through. I think in a nutshell what I would be asking, all of you all are responsible to do everything you can to keep us safe, and you've done a tremendous job as far as from a foreign attack and things of that sort. And Director Ray, I appreciate what the FBI does, and they have a strong presence in West Virginia, and we're very, very appreciative of that. What type of efforts from each one of your agencies have you spent as far as is drugs and fighting the drug infestation highest on your priority list, one of your greatest dangers, or is it just part of the overall scheme of things? And
well, just speaking for the intelligence, just speaking for the intelligence community, it is a high priority for us. We mentioned it in our threat assessment here, and so we are the collectors of foreign sources at transnational organizations, et cetera. What it's coming from overseas, whether it's coming from Afghanistan, whether it's coming from Colombia, what it is, how it's going, and then, of course, it is a whole of government because once it penetrates the United States, we then use our domestic agencies to address
Director Ray,
that.
as far as in the FBI, because you're on the front line, you're here on the homeland, and what do you think? What can we do to help?
Well, I think on the good news side, in a country that's often very divided, this is one issue, as far as I can tell, where everybody agrees about what a major threat it is. It covers communities from north to south, from red to blue, from rich to poor, from urban to rural. And I think it has, that's the good news. The bad news is it's grown to a point where there's no one agency or one approach that's going to solve the problem. So we're doing our part. Some of the things that we're able to do, we're focusing particularly on gatekeepers, because a lot of this is coming through medical professionals and pharmacies. And so we're using intelligence-driven operations there, various initiatives. We have a prescription drug initiative that's focused on that part of it. We're partnering with our foreign counterparts. We're working with DEA, state and local law enforcement, et cetera. We're also trying to do things to raise awareness. We did a video with DEA called Chasing the Dragon, which has, kind of been shown in schools around the country. But this is a multidisciplinary problem.
My time is short. Yeah. If I could just ask this question, maybe whoever wants to answer this one. Based on what we know and the way we distribute money to for foreign aid to different countries, knowing that a lot of the countries we distribute aid to is basically permitting this type of scourge coming to our country as far as in the form of drugs. Have you all thought and considered and make recommendations that we hold them hostage, if you will, or liable basically to the money they're receiving from the United States for the best of intentions? But that best of intentions is their fight against drugs coming to our country when we know it's coming from whether it be China, Afghanistan, Iraq, wherever it may be coming from, Mexico, and all the South American countries. We should hold that. I mean, I've never seen it. We're going to lose a whole generation. In West Virginia, I have 10,000 jobs I can't fill. The United States has 3 million jobs we can't fill, and most of it is around drugs. So this is what we're asking for. This has got to be all hands on deck. I don't know if anybody wants to. Do you all have that as a high priority? Does anyone believe we should withhold foreign aid to countries that basically we know have illicit drugs coming to our country?
Senator, I'll answer this. I think the United States should use every tool whether that's foreign aid or other tools.
It seems like money talks.
To get these, and that's exactly right, to get these nations that this is coming from to put it as a priority for their country too. Some don't have the capacity to fix it. That is, it's a problem that's bigger than their nation. But we should be unafraid to use the leverage that comes with our generosity from the American taxpayer to ensure that these countries are doing everything they can to prevent drugs from coming from their country to ours.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
As you do know, we do provide efforts within countries to help them eradicate. It hasn't been totally successful, but that is one way in which we use some of that aid if it's directly contributed to the eradication of drugs.
Thank you all.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your appearance, and thanks to all the men and women who you represent and the work they do for our country. Mr. Ray, are you aware of a gentleman by the name of Oleg Deripaska?
I've heard the name.
Is it fair to call him a Putin-linked Russian oligarch?
Well, I'll leave that characterization to others, and certainly not in this setting.
Chuck Grassley, the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, last week sent a letter to a London-based lawyer who represents Mr. Deripaska and asked if Christopher Steele was employed either directly or indirectly by Oleg Deripaska at the time he was writing the so-called Steele dossier. Do you know if Christopher Steele worked for Oleg Deripaska?
That's not something I can answer.
Could we discuss it in the classified setting?
There might be more we could say there.
Thank you. And maybe we'll hear back from the lawyer in London as well to give us a straight answer. Jim Comey testified before this committee in an open setting last summer, and he referred to the Steele dossier as salacious and unverified. Does that remain the FBI's position?
I think maybe there's more we can talk about this afternoon on that.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to turn my attention to the threat posed by China and specifically Chinese telecom companies. Senator Rubio spoke earlier, and I agree with what he said about the threat of a rising China and also the threat of Confucius centers. There's also the threat that telecom companies, specifically Huawei and ZTE, but also Unicom and Telecom, pose to our country. That's why I've introduced legislation with Senator Cornyn and Senator Rubio to say the U.S. government can't use Huawei or ZTE, and that the U.S. government can't use companies that use them. And I'm glad that some companies like Verizon, AT&T, among others, have taken this threat seriously. Could you explain what the risk is that we face from ZTE and Huawei being used in the United States, especially here in this public setting, the risk that companies, state governments, local governments might face if they use Huawei or ZTE products and services?
I think probably the simplest way to put it in this setting would be that we're deeply concerned about the risks of allowing any company or entity that is beholden to foreign governments that don't share our values to gain positions of power inside our telecommunications networks. That provides the capacity to exert pressure or control over our telecommunications infrastructure. It provides the capacity to maliciously modify or steal information, and it provides the capacity to conduct undetected espionage. So at a 100,000-foot level, at least in this setting, those are the kinds of things that worry us. I will say, like you, Senator, we've been gratified, I think, to date by the response of the large U.S. telecommunications providers to our trying to raise awareness on this issue. But I also recognize that the competitive pressures are building, and so it's something that I think we have to be very vigilant about and continue, as you all are doing, to raise awareness about.
Admiral Rogers, would you care to add anything about the threat posed by Huawei?
I would agree with Director Ray's characterization here, and this is a challenge I think that's only going to increase, not lessen over time for us.
So you would suggest to mayors, county judges, university presidents, state legislatures to look warily if Huawei or ZTE comes bearing gifts to them?
I would say you need to look long and hard at companies like this.
All the witnesses, I'd like to address this question to you. Will you please raise your hand if you would use products or services from Huawei or ZTE? None of you would. You obviously lead intelligence services, so that's something of a biased question. Raise your hand if you would recommend that private American citizens use Huawei or ZTE products or services. None of you, again, are raising your hand. Thank you for that. Finally, I'd like to turn to a question, Director Pompeo, that's been in the news in the last few hours. There are reports that over 200 Russian mercenaries were killed in eastern Syria. Can you confirm or deny those reports?
Senator Cotton, I'll leave to the Department of Defense to talk about what transpired there. I can say this from an intelligence perspective: we have seen in multiple instances foreign forces using mercenaries in battles that will begin to approach the United States.
General Ashley, since you represent the Department of Defense, would you like to confirm or deny?
Yeah, if we could take that to a closed session, Senator, I think we can lay out a rather interesting fabric of what is Syria and what transpired over the last week.
We can address that in the afternoon. Director Pompeo, to come back as a general matter, can I ask, is massing and maneuvering forces against a location where U.S. personnel are present in Syria a good way to get yourself killed?
I think I'll defer that to the Department of Defense as well.
General Ashley, would you like to answer that question?
So that does make you more susceptible. I would leave that also to the operational commander, but you are at greater risk when you start to mass in that situation.
Not a good idea if you want to have a long and fruitful life. Thank you.
Senator Harris.
Thank you. I want to echo the comments of my colleagues in thanking the men and women who serve in your agencies. I am concerned that the political attacks against the men and women of your agencies may have had an effect on your ability to recruit, retain, and also the morale of your agencies. So I would like to emphasize the point that we all, I think, share in making, which is we thank the men and women of your agencies for their selfless work. They do it on behalf of the American people without any expectation of award or reward, and we cannot thank them enough for keeping us safe. Director Wray, Chairman Nunes's memo included sensitive FISA information regarding a person who worked on the president's campaign. According to the White House statement, the president was the one who authorized the memo's declassification. Do you believe there is an actual, or at least the appearance of a conflict of interest when the president is put in charge of declassifying information that could complicate an ongoing investigation into his own campaign?
Well, Senator, as we've been very clear what our view was about the disclosure and accuracy of the memo in question, but I do think it's the President's role as Commander-in-Chief under the rule that was invoked to object or not to the declassification. So I think that, that is the President's responsibility.
Regardless of whether there is an appearance or actual conflict of interest?
Well, I leave it to others to characterize whether there's an appearance or actual conflict of interest, but I think the President was fulfilling his responsibility in that situation.
If the President asked you tomorrow to hand over to him additional sensitive FBI information on the investigations into his campaign, would you give it to him?
I'm not going to discuss the investigation in question with the President, or much less provide information from that investigation to him.
And if he received that information and then wanted to declassify it, would he have the ability to do that from your perspective?
Information from the...
However he received it, perhaps from members of the United States Congress.
I think legally he would have that ability.
And do you believe the President should recuse himself from reviewing and declassifying sensitive FBI material related to this investigation?
I think recusal questions are something I would encourage the President to talk to the White House counsel about.
And has the FBI done any kind of legal analysis on these questions?
Well, happily, I'm no longer in the business of doing legal analysis. I now get to be a client. And blame lawyers for things instead of being the lawyer who gets blamed. So we have not done legal analysis. Have you blamed any lawyers for their analysis of this issue?
What's that? Have you blamed any lawyers for their analysis of this issue?
I have not yet, no.
Okay. Is the FBI getting the cooperation it needs from social media companies to counter foreign adversaries' influence on our elections?
I think the cooperation has been improving. I think we're continuing to work with the social media companies to try to see how we can raise their awareness so that they can share information with us and vice versa, So I think things are moving in the right direction, but I think there's a lot of progress to be made.
What more do you need from social media companies to improve the partnership that you'd like to have with them to counter these attacks?
Well, I mean, I think we always like to have more information shared more quickly from their end, but I think from their perspective, it's a dialogue. They're looking to get information from us about what it is we see so that they can give responsive information. So I think we're working through those issues.
Do you believe that the social media companies have enough employees that have the appropriate security clearance to make these partnerships real?
That's not an issue I've evaluated, but I'd happy to take a look at it.
Please do and follow up with the committee. Director Coates, one of the things that makes guarding against foreign intelligence threats on social media so complex is that the threat originates overseas, and so that would be within the jurisdiction of the CIA and the NSA. And then it comes to our shores, and then it passes on to the FBI and also the social media companies themselves. I'm not aware of any written IC strategy on how we would confront the threat to social media. Does such a strategy exist in writing?
I would have to get back with you on that. I'd be happy to look into it. From my perspective right now, a written strategy, specific strategy is not in place, but I want to check on that.
Okay, please do follow up. And also, last year, Congress passed a bipartisan Russia sanctions bill. However, the administration has not imposed those sanctions. From an intelligence perspective, what is your assessment of how Russia interprets the administration's inaction?
I don't have information relative to what the Russian thinking is in terms of that particular specific reaction. There are other sanctions, as you know, that are being imposed on Russian oligarchs and others through the United Nations and through other things that have been done. In reference to the JICPOA. But specifically on your question, I don't have an answer for that.
Senator Harris, you provide? Yes.
May I just comment? I think we ought to look at that in a broader context. That is how the Russians view all of the actions of this administration, not just a particular set of sanctions or the absence thereof. So as we've watched the Russians respond to this administration's decision to provide defensive weapons in Ukraine, to push back against Russian efforts in Syria, sanctions placed on Venezuela were directly in conflict with Russian interests. The list of places that the Russians are feeling the pain from this administration's actions are long.
But, Director Pompeo, I'm sure you would agree that in order to understand the full scope of effect, it is also important that we analyze each discrete component, including what is the interpretation of this administration's failure to enact the sanctions, as has been passed and directed by the United States Congress in a bipartisan manner. Have you done that assessment?
So, Senator, in closed session, I'll tell you what we know and don't know about that discrete issue.
Great.
And I'm happy to, yes, and I agree with you. It is important to look at each one in its own place. But I think what we most often see in terms of Russian response, it's to the cumulative activities in response to Russian activities. That is how the United States responds to those in a cumulative way.
Thank you. I look forward to our conversation.
Yes,
Thank
ma'am.
Cornyn.
Director Coates, you alluded to the activities of transnational criminal organizations, and I'm thinking particularly as regards our neighbors down south of our border. Recently, I heard somebody refer to the cartels, these transnational criminal organizations, as commodity agnostic. In other words, they'll traffic in people, they'll traffic in drugs and other contraband, all in pursuit of money.
Whatever brings in the most dollars.
Senator Manchin, I know, and others have alluded to their concern about, and certainly we all share the concern about the deaths and overdoses caused by drugs in America, much of which comes across our southern borders through our ports of entry. This week we're going to be considering border security measures as part of a larger package that the President has proposed while addressing the so-called DACA recipients. But do you believe that modernizing our ports of entry, providing an enhanced technology and other means to surveil and follow and identify illegal drugs coming across our ports of entry would be a good thing for us to do?
I do think that a layered approach is necessary to, it's clear that just one specific defense put in place is not going to solve the problem. It needs to be a layered interest of not only physical facilities, but also Border Patrol, also how those who arrive and perhaps dissipate in waiting for their court appearance, tracking them. There's a whole range of things that I think are going to be needed to stop that flow from coming in.
I know it's been alluded to, but let me just emphasize my concerns that with the demand side. Maybe we've given up, I hope not, in addressing the demand side, which of course provides the money and the incentive for these cartels to operate, and something I think deserves the full attention and focus of the United States government. I've heard General Kelly in his previous job at DHS and talk about that, and I hope we will return to that focus as part of this layered approach, the demand side, because it's something I think that is maybe the hardest thing to deal with, but perhaps might have the greatest impact.
Yeah, the supply depends on the demand, and the demand drives the supply and provides the capital in which to take extraordinarily methods that bypass our defenses in order to get those drugs into the United States. And on the demand side, this is a whole of the American people process. It's PTAs. It's, we growing up got these videos of, driving and driver's training and the horrendous look at crashes and so forth and so on. We need to let every student know. We need to let what the consequences of these drugs are to their lives and to their future. We need to get parents involved, parent-teacher associations involved. So whether they pick up their values from church or from the neighborhood or whatever, this is a national crisis, and all of us here represented or are from states which are staggering through the process here of watching young people and others die from drugs that are more potent than they've ever been.
Let me just lay down a couple of markers here in my comments, but then I want to end on CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States. I will join Senator Rubio and Senator King, Senator Langford, and others concerned about the failure of the U.S. government, again, to have an all-of-government strategy to deal with the cyber threat. I have no doubt in my mind that we have superior capabilities, and but they're stovepiped, and I don't think the policymakers are doing a good enough job, and I think it's incumbent upon us to try to provide some policy guidance so that you and others in the intelligence community and the national security apparatus can address this threat in a way that needs to be addressed. Our adversaries don't suffer from a lack of an all-of-government policy. They are all over that. And China, I agree with Senator Rubio about their strategy, and some of you have responded to that. But one of the strategies that China and other countries have adopted is to avoid some of the review measures in the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States when it comes to direct investment, buying those dual-use technologies, startup companies and the like, and then using that to gain strategic advantage against the United States. I wonder if maybe Director Wray, could you address that, and then anybody else in the time permitted, I'd be glad to hear what you had to say about that.
Well, Senator, I think you're exactly right that CFIUS reform is particularly relevant to the China threat, although not exclusively China threat. And there's a degree to which CFIUS, as it currently stands, is susceptible too much to the kind of round pegs, only go in round holes kind of thing. And it's not hard to come up with other shaped pegs to get around that process. The obvious example being joint ventures, but there are other ways as well. So that's one of the significant problems. Another problem is the amount of time that's built into the process to do a thorough review, which is too short. Another problem is the inability to share information, since other countries our allies are going through the same thing, to be able to share information So when they go through their own versions of a CFIUS process, they have the benefit of what was attempted in our country and vice versa. And I think in general we need to take a more strategic perspective on China's efforts to use acquisitions and other types of business ventures as opposed to just a tactical looking only within the four corners of one particular transaction.
So if I could, because the director laid out really kind of the bigger issue at the strategic level, and for us at DIA, we're kind of taking on the tactical. So we're the ones that are right about ready to penetrate the line. So if you look at supply chain risk management, we actually run the Threat Analysis Center that is hooked into CFIUS, and so we bring the services together and look at supply chain risk management for CI issues associated with whomever may get a contract and ties back to China and other nations. But you allude to the fact that every case for CFIUS for us comes back and we take a look at it. We get about 3 days with it. We could use more time to make more, really more thorough scrub.
Thank you. Thank you.
Senator Reid.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for being late. We had a simultaneous hearing in the Armed Services Committee on SOCOM. But all morning, gentlemen, we've heard the story of Russia influencing our campaigns and indeed in the current campaign for the midterms. So let me begin with Mr. Ray and say, has the President directed you and your agency to take specific actions to confront and blunt Russian influence activities that are ongoing?
We're taking a lot of specific efforts to blunt Russian
directed by the President?
Not as specifically directed by the President.
Okay. Director Pompeo, have you received a specific presidential direction to take steps to disrupt these activities? Could you put on?
I'm sorry. I'm not sure how specific. I mean, the President's made very clear we have an obligation from our perspective, from foreign intelligence perspective, to do everything we can to make sure that there's a deep and thorough understanding of every threat, including threats from Russia.
But as he singled out the Russian threat, which appears to be critical to this election coming up, I know there are threats from many different vectors, but have you received a specific threat, i.e. it's very important to him to get this done correctly?
Yeah, I think the President's been very clear that he has asked our agency to cooperate with each of the investigations that's ongoing and do everything we can to ensure that we thoroughly understand this potential threat.
Director Coates, have you received a specific directive to take specific steps to disrupt and understand first and then disrupt Russian activities directed at our elections in 2018?
I would echo what Director Pompeo just said. We work together on this throughout the agency. Has full understanding that we are to provide whatever intelligence is relevant and make sure that that is passed on to our policymakers, including the President.
Passing on relevant intelligence is not actively disrupting the operations of an opponent. Do you agree?
No, we pass it on and they make the decisions of how to implement it.
As the Director of Intelligence, have you are aware of or leading an interagency and intergovernmental working group that is tasked with countering Russian activities, not merely reporting on it, but tasked with countering those activities? Are you aware of any type of interagency group, any intergovernmental groups, since state elections are critical or state elected officials are critical?
Well, we essentially are relying on the investigations that are underway.
So the answer,
both with this committee and the HPSC committee, and as well as the special counsel.
So you're not taking any specific steps based on the intelligence to disrupt Russian activities that are occurring at this moment?
We take all kinds of steps to disrupt Russian activities in terms of what they're trying to do. I think I'll turn it over to Director Pompeo to.
Let me finish with the rest of the gentlemen. Are you finished, Mr. Coates?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Senator Reid, we have a significant effort. I'm happy to talk to you about it in closed section. The CIA is, and it is not just our effort. It is certainly all of IC effort. There may be others participating as well to do our best to push back against this threat. And it's not just the Russian threat. It's Iranians and Chinese. It's a big, broad effort.
I understand, Mr. Director. We have mutual threats, but one threat that has been central to our, and you've testified this publicly, the last election there was a Russian influence. This election, they seem to be more prepared. They've learned their lessons. The simple question I've posed is, have the President directed the intelligence community in a coordinated effort, not merely to report, but to actively stop this activity? And the answer seems to be, I'm hearing, is the reporting's going on as we're reporting about every threat coming into the United States. Let me get back to quickly, do any of the other panelists have anything to add on this point?
For us, I can't say that I've been explicitly directed to, quote, blunt or actively stop. On the other hand, it's very clear, generate knowledge and insight, help us understand this so we can generate better policy. That clearly, that direction has been very explicit in fairness.
But I think, again, you may agree or disagree, collecting intelligence, then acting on it in a coordinated fashion are two different things.
Yes, sir. I'd also argue what's our role as intelligence professionals in all this.
Let me just end. I've got very few moments remaining. We've talked a lot about China, CFIUS, their involvement in trying to buy companies in the United States. What I think has to be pointed out, too, is they are undertaking a significant national investment in artificial intelligence and quantum computing that is dwarfing anything that the administration is proposing or suggesting. If artificial intelligence has even half of the benefits that its promoters claim, it is going to be extraordinarily disruptive. Quantum computing has a capacity to undercut cryptology as we know it, and the experts can correct me if I'm wrong. Some of the mechanisms that quantum computing can generate could, based on infinite measurements of gravity, detect devices underground and under the water, which for anybody who's a submariner, you've got to be wondering. So where is our national Manhattan program for AI and quantum computing that will match the Chinese? Director Coach, you seem to be anxious to answer that, and I'll let you do that.
Well, I think there are some things that we ought to talk about in classified setting here. We're treading a very narrow line here relative to discussing this in an open meeting.
I don't want to tread that line, but we do have to recognize that, again, the Chinese activity to appropriate our intellectual property is obvious. They're generating their own intellectual property at a rate that could be disruptive, and we are not matching them. Again, this Manhattan analogy might be a little bit out of date, but when we saw the potential effects of a scientific development back in the 40s, we spared no expense so that we would get it first before our opponents. The Chinese seem to be making that type of commitment very publicly. Hundreds, millions, billions of dollars that they've said publicly. They have a plan, and they're working the plan.
And we provide that information to the extent that we can collect that information, but just like the Manhattan Project, we don't openly share what steps that we're taking to address it.
I respect that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Senator Reid, and I do hope you'll come back to the closed session if you can this afternoon. I think that you'll get some fidelity in that closed session. I want to turn to we're about to wrap up. Everybody can look up. There are no more questions. So you don't have to lose eye contact with us, hoping you're not the guy that they're going to ask to answer. You can tell who the newbies are. They've stayed focused on the members the entire time, and the ones that have been here before have been like this. I want to turn to the Vice Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and we look forward to seeing you all this afternoon. Robert, we hope to get some overhead questions to you this afternoon. Echoing what we've all said, appreciate your service. But I think we're hearing again a lot of commonality as we think about cyber, misinformation, disinformation. It really is asymmetrical. And one of the things that has struck me is that if you do a rough calculation and add up the costs to Russia in terms of their intervention in America, elections, the Dutch elections where they hand-counted all the ballots, the French elections where Facebook acknowledged taking down 30,000 sites, you add that all together, it's less than the cost of one new F-35 airplane. Pretty good bang for the buck. I remember a year or so ago at Langley looking at some of our fighter technology, stealth technology, and the colonel showing around bemoaning the fact that the Chinese had gotten this again on the cheap by stealing a lot of the intellectual property that that underlies that technology. And echoing what Senator Reid said, and again, I think this is where we all need to put our heads together. We just made a massive additional investment in DOD. We're roughly 10x the size on our spend versus our near-peer adversaries like China and Russia. I do feel not that from a criticism standpoint, but more from just where we ought to be thinking about going forward, that we may be buying the best 20th century military that money can buy when we see our near-peer adversaries making these massive investments in areas like AI, machine learning, quantum computing. And I think we all need to kind of think through this from a general strategic standpoint. I worry that we've got certain low-hanging fruit as we think about Chinese tech companies and how to get CFIUS right. One of the things some of us have discussed with you in the past is if you look simply at IoT connected devices, we're going to double the number, about 10 billion to 20 billion in the next 3 to 5 years. Yet we have no even de minimis security requirements for the federal government purchasing of IoT devices. And I know I've talked with General Ashley on this. I don't believe there is even across the IC and DOD prerequisite that before we buy some of these connected refrigerators or sensors or common consumer goods, that there be that patchability or no embedded passcodes. So I think again, there's a lot of work we can do, but we don't have the luxury of short time. Senator Blunt raised some of the questions around election security, and I know the chairman's going to make this comment in his closing remarks. I think this committee has done some very good bipartisan work on a series of areas that arose out of the Russia investigation. It's our hope that on election security we can come forward with a set of recommendations very quickly, because we have primaries coming up as early as March, and my hope is that there will be able to be bipartisan legislation to try to start addressing this issue. So thank you, gentlemen. Look forward to our session this afternoon, and with that I'll turn it over to the chairman.
Thank you, Vice Chairman. And Admiral Rogers, I can't remember whether it was you or somebody else at the table said when we had a closed session about investment, it's not how much we spend, it's how we deploy the capital that we've devoted to a particular thing. And I think as a general statement, we get much better at the way we deploy capital. And I think we deploy it with a measurement tool today on return that's totally different than it was 10 and 20 and 30 years ago, and I think that's important. This committee has a global mandate, a mandate that I think has been reflected, in the statements and the questions of the members of this committee today. It's my hope that the American people got a sense of the breadth of topics this committee deals with on a daily basis, and so do you. What was unsaid today? What was unsaid is that the special counsel is not the only investigation that's going on in Washington. The scope of the special counsel's investigation was clearly stated by the DAG when he hired Bob Mueller. And I think the media has spent some portion of every day trying to portray that the scope of that investigation has changed. Truth is, I don't know. Not sure that anybody in this room knows. But here's what I do know. I know the Senate Intel investigation continues. We're hopefully wrapping up some important areas that we have focused on. The Vice Chairman just alluded to the fact that it is our hope and our belief that before the primaries begin, we intend to have an overview of our findings that will be public. We intend to have an open hearing on election security, and it's the committee's intent to make recommendations that will enhance the likelihood that the security of our election process is in place. In addition to that, our review of the ICA, the Intel Community Assessment, which was done in the December of 2016, we have reviewed in great detail. And we hope to report on what we found to support the findings where it's appropriate, to be critical if, in fact, we saw areas that we found came up short. We intend to make that public. Overview to begin with, none of these would be without a declassification process, but we will have a public version that we air as quickly as we can. And the third piece of review of when we learned of Russia's intrusions into our system, what we did or what we didn't do. And again, with the intent of sharing as much of that with the American public as we can find through open hearings and through an overview. Lastly, we will continue to work towards conclusions related to any cooperation or collusion by any individual, campaign, or company with efforts to influence the outcome of elections or to create societal chaos in the United States. I want to thank each of you at the table for an unprecedented access to intelligence products, legal documents, and other materials that were needed for us to do our job. We have a very talented group of individuals who have conducted this investigation. The remarks of every individual who has come in before us has commented on their professionalism and the fact that at the end of 8 hours they couldn't tell who was a Democrat and who was a Republican. So the effort to be bipartisan has not just been public, it is private as well, and permeates all the way down through our staff. They couldn't do this in a timely fashion if it wasn't without the access that each of you have provided us and your agencies. And let me just reiterate again, we understand that this is an unprecedented access to this information. I promised you when we started a year ago that the sensitive nature of that material would in fact be protected. The Vice Chairman and I have done everything in our power to do that. We think we have maintained that promise. There have been times where information has found its way out, some of recent, where it didn't come from us, but certainly people have portrayed it did. And that's okay, because you know and we know the security measures we've got in place to protect the sensitivity of that material. We have also protected the sensitivity of the individuals that have been interviewed voluntarily. The individuals who have come in, what they've shared with us, to date we have not released any interview notes, because that's not for public consumption. We ask people to come in and share with us things that help us understand what happened. It's our responsibility to take that information and to put it into some form that furthers the American people's understanding and assurance that we have thoroughly reviewed this. We will continue the promise that we made to each of you till the conclusion of this investigation and on. There are no expectations that everything you have shared with us is now a precedent that you have to continue. I hope it's not. I have said publicly and criticized for it that our committee was created to operate in secrecy. I believe that's where we perform our best work, and we're given the opportunity and the need for the American people to have a better understanding that we should provide that for them in as controlled an atmosphere as we do. Today is an example of that, and we can now move from a public setting to a more private and closed setting to continue to get some clarity on some of the issues that our members need. I want you to understand the takeaway here. The takeaway is this committee has and will continue to focus on answering the question that was given to this committee from an investigation standpoint, what Russia did to influence the 2016 elections. There are efforts to expand our efforts. They are not internal. We realize we have to answer for the American people, what did Russia do to mess with the 2016 elections. And like many of you on some of the questions when we've asked that we're specific about it in public and in private, we find it's multi-jurisdictional. We've got to begin to sort that out for us, the American people. So I thank you for your willingness to be here today. I thank you for the performance of your employees who have worked tirelessly with very little thanks and of late with a lot of criticism to keep this country safe. And I might say to keep other countries safe, because we are very generous when we know that bad things are going to happen. The committee is appreciative of the relationship that we have. We will continue to work to earn your trust, because that's the only way we can perform the type of oversight that we believe the committee is mandated to do. And for the cooperation that each one of you provides us, we're grateful for that. With this hearing's adjourned until closed session at 2:30.